Lies of P is by far one of the best games I have played this year, and it does make me question whether or not Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is in fact my game of the year. Because a game like Lies of P doesn't come by very often. There's a lot of Soulsbourne like clone games that exist that try to tell an engrossing story, that try to replicate some of the rich and punishing combat that Dark Souls is known for, and that try to really harness the idea of a dark fantasy universe. And a lot of them don't succeed. I don't talk about them all that often because I don't want to say they're a dime a dozen, but clearly based on the wild success of From Software, it's very easy for studios to come along and say, oh, we'll just replicate that formula. But they lack the idea of narrative storytelling told in a somewhat broken format, essentially. A way where NPCs aren't clearly telling you everything up front. You're having to learn about the world via a lot of environmental storytelling. The way you're having to learn about the story is by reading item descriptions and by slowly piecing together parts of the story to understand the motivation behind the heroes and the villains that you're going to face. That part of the storytelling in of itself is difficult to do, let alone mirror some of Dark Souls' finesse combat with stamina management and the risk and reward of large weapons versus small weapons, and the various mechanics such as a perfect parry or figuring out a great balance between overall character weight and general encumbrance, right? So there's a lot of systems in place that have to come together to make a really good Dark Souls type experience. And From Software is an absolute master of it. Elden Ring is clearly a wonderful display of their prowess. So when I saw that Lies of P was coming out and it was going to be the next in line to replicate this and to say, yep, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're just going to have a slightly different tone to our game taking place in the Bella Epoque period, having to do with robotic puppets who may or may not be related to or resembling Pinocchio, the children's tale. I was naturally intrigued because I love these types of games. And while I would not consider myself a Pinocchio enthusiast by any stretch of the imagination, I understand the concept behind the story of Pinocchio and the message of what does it really mean to be a human. So when Lies of P came out, I downloaded it on Game Pass, the same as a lot of other people, and I instantly fell in love with the visuals. More than anything else, the way that the game presented itself, the way that the heroes and the villains were portrayed, the costumes that they had, the environmental storytelling that takes place very, very early on. Within the first 5 minutes, you get a sense for how bleak and how dystopian this Hotel Krat is. And the fact that you have woken up to something really, really rotten. And it's up to you to kind of put together the story and to understand what's happening instantly drew me in. The combat was phenomenal. The gameplay was phenomenal. But in the end, I found myself really being drawn mostly to how the story was told and what the message of the story was. That really makes this game stand apart of a lot of other games that I've played. When you think about the idea of what it means to be human, and you think of the idea of humanity at its most simple kind of root purpose or the existence behind what it means to be human. There's a lot of great answers, by the way, on what that really means. This game tries to tackle that as well. It really delves into a lot of the idea that humanity has created something to make it easier to be a human, to enter into this era of what they call the Age of Beauty, where humans flourished in art, in music, and in culture, while they set robotic puppets to go be the ones to do a lot of the manual labor around the world. So much so that the manual labor really made humans helpless when the time came to fight back against the creators, the creations versus the creators in what they call the puppet frenzy, which essentially was a giant war between the puppets rallying against humanity. What makes this story so interesting, though, and what really drew my attention to it was you find out later on why the puppets were doing what they were doing. And it's not as nefarious as it may seem. And that added a new element to it as well, particularly when you look at the character design of some of the puppets and realize that they may or may not have been fighting against their will, which is a really interesting backdrop just in of itself. Now, the tale of Pinocchio specifically being interjected into the story was very interesting. I think most of us, I know me, definitely, only really know of Pinocchio from the Disney cartoon. I know there was a book written about it, which really did lay out a lot more adventures of Pinocchio, the idea of this mischievous wooden child puppet trying to become a human. And he went through a lot more in the book, which is where a lot of this game source material is pulled from. But you will find things that you could relate to the cartoon, at least, like the donkey children and some of the names of the characters and some of the locations you'll visit. You'll be like, oh, I remember that. But the fact that they were able to weave all that into a meaningful story and wrap it around this dark fantasy trope is nothing short of amazing. The writing staff behind this game is incredible. And I can tell that a lot of care was put into telling this story without giving too much away early on. You know, a lot of times in video games, you really kind of figure it out very early on. You know, the villain in the room who's pretending to be a good guy, but it's really a bad guy, and it's super transparent within seconds. Even up to the final moments of this game, I struggled to figure out who the real villain was. And when you start to introduce so many new characters and stories, and you overlay some of those stories into each other and see how the characters have interacted with the environment, which have interacted and created some of these horrific villains that you're going to have to fight throughout the game. But then understanding the villain's motivations and understanding that it's all tied together at the end in a very logical way. Granted, it was nonsensical. There was definitely a lot of stuff in there that made me go, okay, well, I'm just going to go with it because the story told me to. But if I tried to explain to you, you know, from the beginning to the end of this game what happened, you would look at me like I had three heads. Because you would think, that is wildly crazy. And wait, you're telling me that this happened and there's really more to the story than just humanity versus evil puppets? Absolutely. That's what I'm telling you. There is yet another villain which was not introduced at all in any of the marketing material, which really becomes the main villain later on as the story evolves. And as you start to kind of unravel the mystery and understand the causes that the things you did early in this game that you thought were helping, maybe didn't help quite as much as you thought they would later on in the game. And NPCs that you befriended early on may not be who they appear to be, good or bad. There's a lot of dark history involved here and a lot of past that slowly comes to fruition as characters begin to trust you, as you begin to see what happened to the world before your character, Geppetto's puppet, awakens to try to solve the mystery. And I love that this game tells the story in the way that it does. And that's why I'm always a champion of video games. And one of the reasons I specifically wanted to talk about this game was because this particular story couldn't be told in a movie format. It couldn't be told in the written word. It's something that has to be experienced. And even though the game was very linear in nature, it will very clearly force you to go from one location to another in a very linear fashion with very little choice on the directions you take next. The game still found a way to keep the mystery and the excitement constantly brewing. And as you start to put together certain pieces of lore against the backdrop in which you're fighting, when you take a close look at the enemies you're fighting and you kind of piece the story together, you start to realize there's a much deeper level to this game that exists. Of course, it conveniently wraps up in a way that was satisfying for me. I think the idea of having multiple endings was good. I don't know what the canon ending will be, although based on one of the really bad endings, I assume that's not canon, at least in terms of potential sequels, especially if they take place in or around this part of the world. However, I will say that having a somewhat deciding choice in how the game progresses, being given options to lie or to not lie, the ramifications of that, the ramifications of taking on challenges and taking on things that are larger than you, showing you what it really means to be a hero and what it really means to be a human, I think really kind of drew me into this experience a lot more than I thought that it would. And that ending, the post-credit scene ending, blew my mind. If they can actually pull this off and make a sequel to Lies of P in this same universe that involves the source material that they tease at the end of this game, everybody's mind's going to be blown. I know mine is. Just seeing the idea of that really goes to show that this game studio is willing to take serious risks and taking a hard look at stories of the past and stories that you know and love and putting a very dark fantasy RPG-esque mask over the top of them. And I can only begin to imagine what a sequel to this game could look like with that source material, and it makes me incredibly excited. Lies of P is one of the best games I have played this year. I would argue it's in the top 15 games that I have ever played. Definitely ranks up there in terms of just pure storytelling. Of course, if you like the Dark Souls idea and you like difficult, punishing combat, this game is going to appeal to you. Unlike other Dark Souls games, this game felt fair, except for the final boss. The very final challenge that you have to do, which is an optional boss, by the way, did seem a little aggressive based on everything I had played up to that point. But I never felt like the game was cheap, and I understood what the game expected of me as a player, and it put challenges in front of me that I thought made logical sense. And while there were the traditional gotchas where there's a guy standing around every corner and instant death because the bridge falls out and you got to run and jump over the bridge because there's a hole in the center, but you don't know it till you step over the wood planks, or the ball of fire that rolls down the hill that kills you as you're 3/4 of the way up. Yes, this game does have that. And while there are some frustrating, like, you want to throw your controller in the air, like, you got to be kidding me moments, ultimately, the way that the story progressed and the pacing and the discovery behind the story absolutely makes it worth, really cemented the story for me and really makes this a very enjoyable experience. So this is my final thoughts on Lies of P. I cannot recommend it enough. It's on Game Pass. I know most of you have Game Pass. Just try it. Try it for 30 minutes. If you don't like it, I get it. But if you just get immediately sucked into the world and you immediately get sucked into the artistic presentation and the storytelling, I promise you a game like this is going to be even more rewarding than you thought as you begin to unravel the pieces. And ask yourself the real question, what does it mean to be human? Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care of yourselves. And until next time, I will see you guys on the other side.